There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This short, parable-y joke, famously now, is how author David Foster Wallace opened up a commencement address to a group of graduates in 2005. There's a lot of different ways to analyze it, but one question worth asking is, does a fish know what water is? Presumably, fish have been swimming around in water their whole lives, and they might not have any idea that it even exists. It might just be something that's so ubiquitous, so common, and so taken for granted that they never consider for a second to perceive it. I was reminded of this speech given by David Foster Wallace, and particularly this opening line, when I was reading James C. Scott's book, Against the Grain. One of his central points is the importance in the study of history of questioning assumptions and doing whatever you can to take a second and step outside the box and try to look at things from a new perspective. This might be the only way to eliminate bias and some of the negative impacts that a certain perspective might have on viewing history. Scott claims that in the same way that a fish would have no idea what water is, that human beings, when studying history, have a built-in bias towards states and institutions because, after all, that's how we've been living. At least many of the people who have been recording history have been living for thousands of years. There might be an implicit bias that people don't even realize is there when looking back at the past, and it might color their view of what happened, and it might impact how they view the truth. For example, as we've been discussing in this series, even the simplest use of terms like civilization or barbarian or dark age, just using those terms might come with a whole host of built-in baggage that's cluttering things up behind the scenes. Taking a closer look at early human history, and in particular how states formed and why states formed, and maybe more importantly, why states collapsed and why they seem to collapse so frequently, as well as asking questions about the usefulness of terms like barbarian and dark age, might help us to understand if we are the fish who don't know what water is, so to speak. And it might help us to understand the environment, the history, the world around us a little bit better. Over the course of the last couple of episodes, we've been talking about the oldest story in history, what James C. Scott calls the civilizational narrative. The basic idea is this narrative tells us that the story of early humans, the origin story of where we came from as a species, is a story of linear progress. Everyone has seen that picture with all the different versions of human beings from left to right, and they're walking across the picture, and it starts with the very primitive caveman-looking, almost ape-looking early human, and it slowly progresses from left to right into a more upright, more civilized, modern human that we would recognize today. The civilizational narrative tells us that early humans were unsophisticated hunters and gatherers, and eventually they figured out how to adjust the environment around them. They learned how to farm, And this created the need for states and governments and religions and all of the things we associate with quote-unquote civilization. But over the course of the past couple episodes, we've been exploring how, first of all, the chronology of this so-called progression doesn't necessarily match up. As a result, it might make more sense, instead of looking at human progress as a linear progression, it might make more sense to look at early humanity as a carousel of sorts, where early humans were opportunists looking to landscape the environment as best they could, construct different niches that they could move back and forth between based on need and based on preference. So rather than progressing from hunting and gathering to agriculture, it looks like the evidence shows that early humans were actually carouseling around using those different techniques at different times, jumping back and forth depending on the situation at hand. We've also been examining how this civilizational narrative seems to have some implicit biases built into assumptions about the way we study history and the things that should be important and the judgments that we make about different cultures and different histories. For example, we talked about how history textbooks and early high school history classes are quick to point out the positives of quote-unquote civilization, those things like written expression and culture and religion and structure and safety and these things. But they don't always point out the negatives as far as what it would have been like for an ordinary human being to be living during this time period. Things that would drastically reduce well-being and were associated with state building. Things like disease, slavery, and warfare. It's worth pointing out that these early states in river valleys such as Mesopotamia, due to these factors like disease and warfare and slavery, were actually incredibly fragile. We tend to think of them as these bastions of early humanity and early human achievement, but in reality, most people around the world were living as quote-unquote barbarians outside of states, and these early states were collapsing and falling apart left and right. And this, for author James C. Scott, is the impetus to start talking about institutional bias and some of the built-in assumptions that we have when we study history. Scott uses the narrative of civilizational collapse to play around with this trope a little bit. What made early civilizations collapse? What does it mean to even say that a civilization collapsed? What do we mean by collapse when we say that? Scott says, quote, "What might collapse mean anyway?" As in the phrases, the collapse of Ur III around 2000 BC, the collapse of Old Kingdom Egypt around 2100 BC, the collapse of the Minoan palatial regime on Crete around 1450 BC. At the very least, it means the abandonment and or destruction of the monumental court center. This is usually interpreted not merely as a redistribution of population, but as a substantial, not to say catastrophic, loss of social complexity. If the population remains, it is likely to have dispersed to smaller settlements and villages. Higher order elites disappear. Monumental building activity ceases. Use of literacy for administrative and religious purposes is likely to evaporate. Larger scale trade and redistribution is sharply reduced, and specialist craft production for elite consumption and trade is diminished or absent. Taken together, such changes are often understood to be a deplorable regression away from a more civilized culture. In this respect, it is just as essential to emphasize what such events do not necessarily mean. They do not necessarily mean a decline in regional population. They do not necessarily mean a decline in human health, well-being, or nutrition, and as we shall see, may represent an improvement. Finally, a collapse at the center is less likely to mean a dissolution of culture than its reformulation and decentralization. End quote. I think what Scott is saying here is that one of the most popular historical narratives out there is this idea of a collapsing early civilization that ultimately leads to what's commonly referred to as a Dark Age. Armchair historians often associate this with the Minoan or Greek Dark Age, as we've mentioned. There's time periods in Egypt where this could be applied, or Mesopotamia, probably most famously after the collapse of the Roman Empire, which is a little bit more modern, but the idea is the same. Scott is analyzing, what do we actually mean when we say that a civilization has collapsed? There tends to be a negative connotation to this, even though that might not necessarily be the case when you look at the well-being of the ordinary people involved in these situations. Scott claims that aside from the implicit biases of civilization, one of the reasons that these states collapsing is seen as such a deplorable and horrible thing is just the fact that it deprives archaeologists and historians of materials to study. He says, quote, "One simple and not entirely superficial reason why collapse is deplored is that it deprives all those scholars and professionals whose mission it has been to document ancient civilizations of the raw materials they require. There are fewer important digs for archaeologists, fewer records and texts for historians, and fewer trinkets, large and small, to fill museum exhibits. There are splendid and instructive documentaries on archaic Greece, Old Kingdom Egypt, and mid-3rd millennium Uruk, but one will search in vain for a portrayal of the obscure periods that followed them, the Dark Age of Greece, the first intermediate period of Egypt, and the decline of Uruk under the Akkadian Empire. Yet there is a strong case to be made that such vacant periods represented a bolt for freedom by many state subjects and an improvement in human welfare." End quote. What Scott is saying here is that states tend to be centralized, particularly early states, and there's usually a state center with statues and buildings and pillars and written texts, obviously. And when a state, quote-unquote, collapses and goes away, there's no more of those buildings, there's no more of those written materials, there's no more of those pillars and columns and buildings for archaeologists and historians to dig up and study. But is a decline in the overall number of big buildings really actually telling us anything about the time period that we're studying from the perspective of the ordinary people involved? Just because there's less archaeological evidence, just because there's less big buildings, doesn't necessarily mean that people were living in a dark age or that well-being was going down. There might be more complexity to it. So when we say that a civilization collapses, perhaps that could be some deplorable and horrible thing, a downfall in order and an increase in chaos, but Scott claims that it's more likely that it was more of just a decentralization or some form of population movement and adjustment without a centralized power. So the question becomes, what do we mean when we say that a civilization collapsed? According to Scott, if you look at the archaeological evidence, there is plenty of evidence throughout early human history that during these so-called dark ages, a lot of settled populations ended up abandoning settled sites, moving elsewhere on what seems to be a very quick turnaround. Scott claims that these collapses or these movements of people or these abandonments of states could happen for a variety of reasons. First and foremost in his book is the idea that the harvest is always a dicey proposition. When early states began to put all of their eggs, so to speak, in the basket of agriculture, and in particular one or two grain staples, then if you had a bad harvest, or if you had disease in your crops, or if you had some sort of calamity or flood that prevented you from harvesting your crops, that could lead to a quick and decisive downfall for an entire state. Scott says, quote, State-making sites were above all structurally vulnerable to subsistence failures that had little to do with how adept or incompetent their rulers were. First and foremost of these structural vulnerabilities was the fact that they depended overwhelmingly on a single annual harvest of one or two cereal staples. If that harvest failed because of drought, flood, pests, storm damage, or crop diseases, the population was in mortal danger, as were their rulers who depended on the surplus they produced. These populations were also, as we have seen, in far greater danger from the infectious diseases that affected them and their livestock because of crowding than were dispersed foragers. And finally, as we shall explore, the reliance of elites on a surplus, together with the logic of transportation, meant that the state relied far more heavily on the population and resources located closest to the core, a reliance that could undermine its stability." End quote. It's possible that strong and capable leadership could prepare for a bad harvest or make sure they didn't happen to some extent, but for many of these reasons for collapse that we're about to talk about, it's very difficult for early people to anticipate these things coming. There's almost no way they could have foreseen this. And one of the reasons for collapse that we already mentioned is disease. And early peoples had a very limited understanding of disease, and they couldn't possibly have prepared for it adequately. So when it hit, it was likely to have been disastrous. Disease could break out in a state center, and it could kill a huge number of people of the population at the state center, or it could actually clear everybody out and act as a sort of decentralizing force. So rather than calling this a collapse, it might be more accurate to call it a disease-centric decentralization. Because even though people didn't understand disease, early people did understand the idea of quarantining and trying to avoid disease in people who were sick. It doesn't take much medical know-how to do that. And as a result, this could be one way that people move out of state centers and decentralize. To the modern historian's eyes, that might look like collapse, but to the people involved, that might have meant simply trying to survive and actually an improvement in well-being. That being said, it wasn't always that easy because as states became more crowded and more common, disease also became more common. There was now more trade to spread that disease. As we talked about in the last episode, warfare was something that was increasingly popular. Population was the wealth of the state, and warfare was how you acquired people to replace those you lost due to disease or to resettle into new communities that you could farm and use to create a surplus for your elites. Ironically enough, warfare is one of the things that spreads disease, as we know in the modern day, with different peoples moving from place to place and engaging with other peoples. It makes sense. James C. Scott says, quote, "In terms of demography alone, there is nothing like warfare for the mass movement and relocation of populations. An army, or for that matter, a mass of fleeing refugees or captives, represents a moving module of infection, contracting and transmitting many of the diseases traditionally associated with war: cholera, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, typhoid fever, and the like. The line of march of armies or refugees has long been known to mark a line of infection from which civilians seek, if they can, to flee. When, as in the case of ancient warfare, the major prize consists of captives who are marched back to the victor's kingdom, the consequences for infectious diseases are much the same as with trade, but perhaps on a larger scale. Among the captives, of course, were the enemy's four-footed livestock, which would have brought their own diseases and parasites along to the victor's capital." End quote. In addition to early civilizations collapsing due to bad harvests or disease or warfare, human-caused climate change rears its ugly head once again. The processes of deforestation, salinization, and other environmental impacts are much more gradual than disease and warfare, but over time they are equally as dangerous. Early states often relied tremendously on wood and deforestation became a major issue for early states, especially upstream of a city-state. Early states would take advantage of the current of the river and often do their logging upstream and then send it downstream to take advantage of the lesser friction, sending the logs down the river to the city capital. But this could lead to problems. There could be a shortage of wood itself due to deforestation. The cut down trees could lead to increased erosion and siltation, which would change the pattern of rivers, which could in turn increase the amount of catastrophic floods. With no more heavily wooded areas to absorb the slow percolation of rainwater, rivers could begin to flood more unpredictably, and they could also change course, leaving a city completely high and dry with no access to the river, and then therefore a desire for the population to move elsewhere. Again, maybe you want to call this collapse, but you might also just call it humans moving to a new location as a result of changes to the environment. Scott also suggests that it's possible that malaria became a early killer of early humanity, in large part because of this high level of deforestation, which created this sort of boggy and swampy environments in many of these river valley situations, which of course would attract bugs and mosquitoes to spread the disease. Different city-states could go to war with each other for a variety of reasons. Of course, you could have local civil wars, insurrections, and power struggles. And of course, this is going to lead to a fragile ecosystem. But warfare might also lead to overtaxing a citizenry and exploiting its citizens a little bit too much by asking for too much grain, too much labor, too much work, and a population might just decide to move elsewhere. So the reality seems to be, as James C. Scott is showing, that there's lots of reasons for early peoples to have abandoned population state centers. And while this is bad for archaeologists because they probably won't get as many big buildings to uncover, there's no reason to assume that the quality of life and the well-being of the actual people went down when these quote-unquote collapses happened. Again, collapse could happen as a result of normal shifting survival mechanisms. It could happen as a result of environmental factors, disease, state oppression, taxation, war, slavery. So is it really appropriate to be labeling these periods of time where people abandon centralized state population centers? Is it appropriate to be labeling these time periods as dark ages? Scott says, quote, "There may well be, then, a great deal to be said on behalf of classical dark ages in terms of human well-being. Much of the dispersion that characterizes them is likely to be a flight from war, taxes, epidemics, crop failures, and conscription. As such, it may stanch the worst losses that arise from concentrated sedentism under state rule. The decentralization that arises may not only lessen the state-imposed burdens, but may even usher in a modest degree of egalitarianism. Finally, providing that we not necessarily equate the creation of culture exclusively with apical state centers, decentralization and dispersal may prompt both a reformulation and a diversity of cultural production." End quote. It seems that James Scott is not necessarily a fan of the term Dark Age. He even goes on to somewhat provocatively suggest that maybe the real Dark Age is these early states exposing early humans to disease and enslavement and warfare, and much of this might be invisible to the human historical record. Another reason Scott doesn't like the term Dark Age is because it creates a sort of dichotomy between the quote-unquote civilized state centers and the barbarians that live elsewhere that are not under state rule. There's often a negative connotation associated with the word barbarian. Some people see the idea of barbarians as people who are less civilized, less cultured, less intelligent, less knowledgeable than people who live in states. So that's one way to look at it. And then, of course, the other negative view of barbarians is that idea of human progression that we've been talking about, this civilizational narrative. If barbarians are lower on the totem pole, so to speak, then that means they're just a less progressed version of humanity. They're a lesser version of human than the humans living in states. James Scott picks apart this narrative for a variety of reasons. And one of them is that, first of all, he says, you have to keep in mind that most people in this early history time period that we're talking about were barbarians. The vast majority of population lived this way, and it's also possible, and probably even likely, that the vast majority of these barbarians were living large. Scott says, quote, "The period between the first appearance of states and their hegemony over non-state peoples represented, I believe, something of a golden age of barbarians. What I mean is that it was in many ways better to be a barbarian because there were states, so long as those states were not too strong. States were juicy sites for plunder and tribute. Just as the state required a sedentary grain-growing population for its predations, so did this concentration of settled people with their grain, livestock, manpower, and goods serve as a site of extraction for more mobile predators." End quote. In some sense, these early quote-unquote barbarians saw these states and civilizations as sitting ducks that they could extract resources from, raid if they needed to, trade, even join if they needed to, before moving on to the next target. There might not have been a strict division between state peoples and barbarian peoples. It's possible, just like people moved from agriculture to hunting and gathering to pastoral nomadism, it's possible that people moved from living in states to being these nomadic barbarian type peoples in their own lifetime. Many barbarians may have originally been members of the state, contrary to this myth of progress and sophistication where barbarians and hunter-gatherers become these sophisticated state peoples. It would not be unusual for people living in states, for any number of reasons that we've already outlined, whether it's disease or warfare, to move beyond the boundaries of the state and become what we would think of as barbarians. It might be useful to think of the idea of the frontier, think of the American West, or think of Puritans sailing to America. Largely, people are moving to the frontier, trying to escape something, and they're being attracted by something else. There's these push and these pull factors. So on the frontier, people are trying largely to start something new while perhaps avoiding the government or avoiding disease or avoiding taxation or avoiding persecution, whatever it is. And this idea could be applied to early humans and the state-barbarian dichotomy. In fact, as we've talked about, when states were building walls, it's worth questioning, were the walls there to keep people out, or were the walls there to keep people in and prevent them from being encouraged by the quote-unquote barbarian lifestyle? Interestingly enough, this idea of civilizational progress and evolutionary progression, for example, Julius Caesar, when he was going and conquering the frontier of the Roman Empire in Gaul, often cited this evolutionary idea of first people became tribes, and then they became barbarians, and then they became incorporated into the state. And that was the progression of things, so to speak. But in reality, you could actually flip the order of those things. According to James C. Scott, it was the state that came first, and as a result, people were pushed out and became barbarians. There's this yin and yang element where there's this mutual coexistence, this mutual dependence. People are moving back and forth. There's sort of a fluid membrane in between civilization and the barbarian quote-unquote tribes. Again, instead of a idea of progression, this idea of a carousel going around and around, yin and yang, co-evolutionary dependence becomes more interesting. At any rate, history shows that barbarian raids were something to take seriously for even the most powerful states, and in many cases, barbarians had a huge military advantage because of their more mobile style of warfare and the fact that they didn't have any settlements to protect or any cities to worry about the other guys laying siege to. Strangely enough, even the most powerful states were terrified of nomadic invasions, and this led to many states often having to pay off or pay tribute to nomads. And these nomad barbarian type people were not stupid, and they realized that if you're a parasite, you don't want to kill the host, you want it to live so that you can continue feeding off of it. So they weren't going to kill the goose that was laying the golden egg. They were going to raid a little bit here, raid a little bit there, inflict just enough damage where they could be getting these tributary payments while still being able to do what they needed to do. Another example of the narrative being challenged because who's taking advantage of who in this situation? Trade is another example that shows how the lines between barbarians and civilization were often more blurred than the civilizational narrative would have us think. Trade has pretty much always been a thing between nomads and settled peoples, and as states became larger and trade networks increased, the scale of this trade became huge. James Scott says, quote, "Central Eurasia had a wealth of products to trade for goods from the agrarian states, especially once shipping opened distant markets. Beckwith provides an extensive list of such products recorded by early travelers. The list is enormous, but an abbreviated version will illustrate its variety. Copper, iron, horses, mules, furs, hides, wax, amber, swords, armor, fabrics, cotton, wool, carpets, blanket cloth, felt, tents, stirrups, bows, fine woods, linseed, nuts, and, never absent from the list, slaves. Raiding by nomadic groups, which resembled warfare by agrarian states, is best understood as a means of acquiring tributary communities and of dominating the trade that circulated through them. It was not a result of nomadic poverty, still less a desire for shiny objects. All nomadic societies were complex in the sense that they practiced some agriculture as well as herding, and had a substantial artisan class, so that they were not normally in need of staple cereals or technical expertise from the agrarian states." End quote. What Scott is saying here, I think, is that just as the state as we think of it during this time period was using the domus complex that we talked about, using the domestication of animals, using the domestication of plants, using the production of grain agriculture, using all of those things to basically exist, to control, to be a state, to do what states do. These barbarians on the outside, just as the states were doing that, they were using the tools at their disposal to control that domus complex, to control that domestication of animals and plants, to control, in some ways, states. Whether that was through raiding, whether that was through trading, whether that was through tributary payments. Again, you see the extent to which there's not necessarily a dichotomy between barbarians and states, but rather they're two different organisms trying to accomplish similar goals, but using different strategies. James Scott refers to this idea as the idea of the state and the barbarians being dark twins. Oftentimes it's best to think of politically united nomadic peoples as twins or foils of the state. They were created necessarily by the way the domus complex and the state runs itself, and ultimately the nomadic peoples, the barbarians, were competing, trading, and using the same resources that the state was. In closing, the myth of progress and the civilizational narrative, the narrative of civilization, is just that. It's a narrative. In some ways, it's accurate and it's comforting, but in other ways, it is misleading and it's lacking. James Scott ultimately, I think, lays out a pretty compelling argument for, at the very least, changing the way we look at early states, why they collapsed, terms like Dark Ages and barbarians, and perhaps doing a better job of analyzing some of the downsides of these results of the Neolithic Revolution. Lastly, I don't think you have to agree with every element of James Scott's argument in Against the Grain. I'm not sure I do agree with every piece of it. But just like the fish in David Foster Wallace's This Is Water, it's always a useful exercise to begin to question your surroundings, to try to uncover the hidden biases and assumptions that might be hiding in plain sight, and to apply this to our study of history.